All right, welcome to our last week of class. It's been awesome. I've really enjoyed having all of you as students. It's been absolutely excellent. I'm only teaching one more class uh, in my career here at Utah this summer, and then I'll be on the job market looking for full-time professorships this fall. So if you're interested in taking another class with me, or not, but in the material of the class I'm teaching at least, I'm teaching existentialism. I think there's 10 or 12 spots left in the class. I run it just the same way that I run this one with the choose your own adventure stuff. It's reading heavy, but it's awesome reading. It'll be a ton of fun. It goes all summer. So if you're interested in existentialism and you want to excuse me, get into Camus and Sartre and de Beauvoir and Dostoevsky and all these guys, then I suggest you take the class. So with that plug out of the way, what is happiness is the topic for our final lecture. And I'll be suggesting that happiness is accessed more easily through a certain state of mind and action called flow state. Okay, so what is happiness? Well, it could just be pleasure, right? Our utilitarians probably thought something along this line. Insofar as utility is the avoiding of pain and seeking of pleasure, then happiness is just that. But pleasure can be extrinsic or intrinsic, right? So we can feel intrinsic pleasure when, excuse me, I'm measuring my pleasure by some quality of feeling that I have, right? Some internal joy or like happiness or whatever, as opposed to like extrinsic pleasure, which the economist or utilitarian form of economist might call like money, right? So like we can measure pleasure in terms of dollars if this is what you're thinking. We might also think that happiness doesn't have to do with any moment of pleasure, but is something broader, right? It's about life satisfaction, that you can't really measure happiness in any moment, because perhaps hard moments of suffering or sadness, of passion in any one direction or valence, might be constituent in their own ways of happiness in general. And so when we're talking about happiness in general, we're talking about life satisfaction sort of across the board. It's a global judgment. Was this life a happy one? It might also just be an emotional state that really has nothing to do with pleasure or life satisfaction, but it's just a matter of to each their own. Are you living the life that you want to live, and do you feel like it? Or is it some blend of these, or is it Soma, right? If we've read, what is it, Brave New World, the drug that just like makes everybody happy by default. Is this real happiness? Who knows? Happiness could also be none of these things. It could have nothing to do with pleasure or satisfaction or drug-induced stony fantasticness. It might not have anything to do with the blend of those things. It might just be simple peace, right? That there's no strong bending in one way or another. I'm going to argue, or at least suggest, that happiness is really some blend of all of these things. And the flow state theory that we read for class today does blend together many of these elements of what we might think of as happiness with the three popular accounts of happiness suggested here, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so to be in a flow state is not necessarily to be happy. However, it is a strong indicator that something is going mostly right. At least this is my suggestion. So in proffering flow as sort of a vehicle of happiness, a mechanism through which we can be and become happy, I'm not saying that it's like a necessary condition of happiness or even a sufficient condition. It's not going to absolutely make you happy if you're in it, or you're unable to be happy if you're out of it, right? This is just not the case, but rather it's strongly correlated with, it runs in parallel to happiness a lot of the time. Okay. So we're going to address what flow states are by first thinking about what expertise is, which is my area of research, because it turns out that experts are very reliably able to get into flow states. And so by looking at what the structure, the underlying structure of expertise in general is, this should give us insight into the overarching structure in general of the flow state, and thus bring us one step closer to the answer to our question, what is happiness? Okay, so what is expertise? There are typically two views in the literature, the just do it view and the cognition in action view. And they're taken to be opposed to one another. That your just do it view of expertise says that one is an expert in virtue of their capacity to not think anymore about what they're doing as they're doing it. They're able to just be completely absorbed and yet act dynamically and flexibly in complex situations, but they're not deciding what to do as they're doing it. They're just doing it, right? Nike's famous tagline. This is to be contrasted with the alternative view, cognition and action. This is Garry Kasparov, one of the greatest chess players of all time. And the chess player example here is, it exemplifies cognition and action because it's not about how little you need to think about what you're doing as you're doing that makes you an expert according to this view. Rather, it is how much you know about your domain of expertise and how well you're able to bring that knowledge to bear in performing as you do. So thinking through sequences and coming up with creative moves and actions in a chess game, for example. So starting with just do it, we have really popular accounts like The Bow Shoots Itself and Zen and the Art of Archery. If you've read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance or Zen and the Art of ... there's like a bajillion books, Zen and the Art of. This is the book that inspired it. That's like where the trope comes from. And what Yugen Harrigal does is he goes to Japan and studies with the Zen master about how to become a bowman, and struggles with it until he realizes that it's only when he disappears in the act of firing the arrow that he really expresses a mastery for the activity, and so recognizes that true mastery is not when I shoot the bow, but rather when the bow shoots itself. This should sound to us like just do it. Here's an example in navigation. So the idea here is imagine the analogy, you move to a new city, and in order to like navigate from your house to work, you need to look at a map. And this guy is clearly having trouble with his phone GPS, looking at an old school map. And you decide the route, the right way to go, right? But then as you live in the city, you make the commute over and over, you sort of begin to understand the traffic patterns. You need the GPS less, you need the map less. And in fact, you need to think about how to get where you're going even less than you started out. So as you learn the streets and the traffic patterns and the commute more generally, you're able to just sort of do it, right? You don't need to think about it. In fact, we should all be familiar with this experience in driving where you just arrive at your destination, right? You're commuting to or from work, and then all of a sudden, like you're back home and you think, dear God, how did I not get in a car wreck? I have no idea where I've been the last 20 minutes of my drive, right? This is a pretty common experience. You don't need to think about the driving as you're doing it when you are very practiced at it. And so this is supposed to like inspire, by analogy, the sort of just do it view of expertise. In sort of a, rather than like a positive example, a negative one would be when you're overthinking. So it's called the yips in golf and in baseball. Rick Ankiel, his whole career destroyed by it. The idea is that you're overthinking what you're doing as you're doing it. Your attention is directed inward at the, how do I perform this action that you've performed so many times before, rather than at the, what are the effects of my action? So you're in the yips, your attentive feature is focused on the wrong parts of action and you overthink it. And then this like completely goofs you up, right? You putt the ball into the rough, or you pitch the ball into the stands, and the pitcher has to pat you on the back and send you to the dugout. So this is the idea of like thinking too much, right? gets in the way of just doing it and gets in the way of our expertise. So where just do it goes wrong. This is not a perfect view of expertise. Well, experts end up thinking a lot in doing what they're doing, right? The chess expert, even athletes who are acting in moment to moment, right? Snap judgments, are making judgments. And there's a whole lot of thinking and structured thought going on mid-performance. Even if some of that performance is automatic, that doesn't mean that all of it is, right? There's a lot of thinking that is essential to overcoming problems and new challenges as they arise in action. So climbers will plan routes or react to strange grips or whatever, recognizing markers for success when they're climbing, especially if they're on-sighting or red pointing a route. Experts need to know rules in order to follow them. So good heuristics for chess plays, keep your pawns connected, take the center, don't trade down material typically, but sometimes you need to break the rules. Sometimes you need to surprise your opponent. You need to sacrifice the queen to get the sneaky checkmate in, right? So you go down material to go up the game, right? And making these sorts of decisions to break the rules is important. We should see this in writing too, right? That the poet is such a master of language that they're able to bend the grammatical rules and ultimately break them to create entirely new styles of writing. Experts need heuristics to get better. You need to know what you're doing in order to get better at doing it. If you're completely blank and unabsorbed or absorbed in what you're doing and you have no sense of it at all, then how are you supposed to have any like grip or texture on like the qualities of your performance to become better at all? Performance is an opportunity for practice. And von Moltke, famous German general, World War I, states, "No plan survives first contact with the enemy," meaning all the best laid plans of mice and men go right. Meaning that when we're in action, all of our practice is only just that, and that whatever we're faced with, we need to overcome the novelty when we are faced with it. So this might lead us to think, well, it's really cognition and action that gives us the right view of expertise, that it's about thinking about what we do as we do it. And again, the coaching thing, you got to like know what you've done in order for a coach to be able to tell you, like, here's how you can do it better. So if your coach says, hey, when like I wrestled for 10 years, if my coach said that I had a sloppy takedown and I said, I have no idea what you're talking about, then the address to the quality of my shot, my takedown, would have I'd have no ability to like work with it to like become better. So feedback requires that I at least have some sense of what I was doing as I'm doing it, so that the feedback can make me better. And this is an important feature of expertise. Here's another sort of interesting example. Vladimir Horowitz is one of my favorite pianists. He's awesome. So was awesome. He's passed away now. But what Horowitz was famous for was interpreting piano pieces in his own way. So he would dramatically play Chopin and in ways that would like shock critics. Like, this is not the original piece, but it was very much Horowitz's own way of doing it, and his stylized way of playing was beautiful, amazing. And so he retires for a bunch of years and comes back to Carnegie Hall in San Francisco or something for a reunion show that everybody's so excited about. And the like third note of this reunion show, he flubs, like plays a flat key and totally goofs up the very beginning of his comeback tour. And as the story goes, which is true, when they released the audio recording on CD and cassette and stuff of this performance, he recorded over his mistake so it didn't exist. But since then, the actual recording has come out, and you can hear in the audience like an audible gasp when he makes this mistake. Like, you know, like everybody's just like, the illusion is shattered so instantly. And yet the way that Horowitz recovers from this mistake, like he flubs the third note and then plays into the flub and turns the flub into like a turn of phrase that communicates with the rest of the music in this really beautiful way that does not exist in the like the official recording. It only exists in the recording, the official recording that came afterwards, the actual recording. And in this, we might think that Horowitz is doing exactly what the cognition and action sort of theorist would think about what is going on and actually going on in expertise. He flubs the third note and thinks, I need to overcome this. This is a problem. How do I recover? And it's not an automatic action. It's not anything he's practiced or has habitualized himself to play. It's a new phrase that he's inventing in the middle of this piece, or right at the beginning of the piece, really. And needs to just like think his way through, how do I turn this into a harmony? How do I turn this into a work of art that communicates with the rest of what I have prepared to perform? And so it's because he's able to think so well about how to turn the mistake into a success that Horowitz is an expert pianist. Okay, so again, cognition and action might go wrong. This is BBK. So reports of expert phenomenology, experts report getting absorbed and saying like, look, I don't know what was going on. I just blacked out while I was doing it. Or I don't know how it happened, but it just did. I was listening to this interview of B.B. King on, it was like some jazz weekend show on like an NPR-esque channel, like local something or other. And the interviewer knew like all this really technical music theory and was describing a way that B.B. King would like bend a string to create a chord that then communicated to the rest of his band to like move on to the next like segment of the jam. And was using all sorts of wild technical language that I don't know. I'm not a music theory guy. But it was just like all of these, if you can imagine like as jargony a conversation like at B.B. King as you can, like just all strange foreign words. That was what the interviewer was saying. And I swear I could like hear B.B. King smiling, like almost like a patronizing smile as he responded, yeah, I didn't plan it. That's what happened, right? And that was it, right? All of this like wild technical language and B.B. King's response is like, yeah, I don't know, that's just the way it went. Because he didn't need to have all of the theory and the like knowledge about what exactly it was that he was doing for the action to be performed and communicate meaningfully to the rest of the band what it needed to do. He didn't plan it. His fingers just did it, right? There's all sorts of split decision, split-second decision-making and expertise where there's not time to think. In a matter of milliseconds, experts have to make decisions, and the decisions they make are better on average than novices, right? So like in that much time, you make a reaction or a decision without thinking this is what I should do or this is how I should do it. You just do it, right? And these are features and moments of expertise that don't afford the sort of cognitive activity that we might think is required of a cognition and action view. There's no time to think, only to react. Okay, so automaticity and expertise. What's the relationship between cognition and automaticity and skilled action? When does automaticity work for experts and when does it act as a false ceiling of success? And likewise, on the other hand, when does thinking get in the way of doing, and how do experts cope with the need to act quickly and fluidly in order to succeed? Where do we find the balance between these two views? Because they both seem a little imperfect. What I'll suggest is that it's in the flow state that we find this balance, at least as a matter of pragmatics. We can pick out where the balance between absorption and thought is by investigating what the flow state is. And likewise, by extension, the quality of the existential quality of the flow state as a kind of happiness that is associated with the blend of absorption and thought of body and mind. Okay, so before we need to do a little bit of term introduction. So phenomenology, I'm sure that I've mentioned this word in class. several times. Let's get a really clear picture of what phenomenology is, because in order to investigate like what absorption is or cognition and action is, what we're going to need to do is investigate the phenomenology of experts and of people in the flow. So phenomenology is a philosophical tradition pioneered by Edmund Husserl in 1930 or 13. And it endeavored to make a science out of human experience. So the idea was, says Husserl, look, we can measure and predict natural phenomena in the world. Like when I see certain weather patterns, I know that it's going to rain. When there's rain, I know that certain plants will grow. So why can't we make the same kind of predictive material investigative theories about the human mind and the human experience? So this is Husserl looking very imposing. Just, that's like turn of the century German as heck, huh? What a guy. Just a frightening photo. Okay, so this is what it's like to do phenomenology. You point at a thing and you feel it. But in contemporary lingo, what is phenomenology? Well, it means what it's like to have an experience. So Thomas Nagel famously argues that phenomenology is a real and tractable feature of the world, but is incommunicable across individuals because it's private. So the idea of a phenomenology is just to say, look, I have an experience. So say like I'm looking at my cell phone and I have an experience that is like a black rectangular object that is sort of thick and has a certain weight. There's just a quality, a qualitative set of properties that I'm experiencing and I have a feeling of. And that's my phenomenology. It's the content of feeling, of experience, of interacting with the world. It's not just the features of the world themselves, but it's the features of the world as we feel them and as we experience them. It's the what it's like of our experience. And every experience, whether acquired through the senses or through intellection, has a particular character, a qualitative sort of status. And it's a quality of what it's like to be experiencing that thing as you do. So I can have a quality of intuiting that I think, therefore I am. And I can have a quality of feeling that this table is hard and it puts pressure on my knuckle when I bang it, right? So here's a question. Can anybody think of why using phenomenology as a scientific datum, as Husserl wants us to do, might be a challenging or controversial pursuit? Why is doing a science of human experience maybe controversial? Yeah, Rachel.
It challenges things like physicalist theories, especially of mind, where it's like, if there's a phenomenological experience that might form something like consciousness in Nagel's argument, then that would go against the reductionary properties in your brain that's causing these different things to happen. Instead, there's this other, external phenomenon of this experiential knowledge that's differentiated from just like our scientific understanding or physical understanding of the world.
Yeah, cool. So what Husserl ultimately wants to do is locate that phenomenology and that human experience in the same kind of theory as physical world materialist, physicalist stuff, right? But what it sounds like you're suggesting is that if we postulate a robustness, like an empirical robustness to quality of mind and phenomenology, then it will certainly be of a different kind of empirical robustness than like the physical, material, natural stuff. And so it would almost force us into a dualism that could be troubling. Yeah, cool. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on why phenomenology might be challenging or controversial? as a science?
Well, I think just researching human experience, like each person is experiencing their world vastly different from like the next person. So how do you quantify or measure, that in like a research study?
Good. Yeah, it's a hugely worrying problem. How do you quantify human experience? Like we've talked about this a little bit. I've sort of railed against the utilitarians for a similar reason, right? It's like quantifying happiness seems almost absurd. Similarly, how do we quantify the human experience in a way that makes sense and works for us? Well, for our very early phenomenologists who are of a more scientific objectivity promoting sort like Husserl, Husserl wouldn't say that we're all experiencing the world vastly differently, as Lily suggested. Rather, he would say, like, look, there's just like a base quality of human experience that all of us participate in. But that is itself a controversial opinion. It's a premise that we may just like jump off the boat of doing phenomenology as a science right there. But I should at least just say that Husserl's version of phenomenology is just like sort of the first pass at it. Phenomenological study goes much further and deeper in both directions. It goes in the scientific direction, largely in psychological practices and therapeutic ones, and also is taken up by the sorts of thinkers that Lily might be sort of amenable to in like, at least with respect to their comment, which is that the phenomenology of experience individually is meaningful and powerful, and having expressive accounts, depictions of phenomenology from the diversity of human experiences, an important tool for diversifying perspective and breaking institution like our deconstructivists and postmodernists and that sort of thing. So phenomenology is like a very helpful term for everybody. It's not just this like science thing. So we shouldn't think that, but at least in this formulation, it is challenging. And so as we go forward and look to the flow state literature, we should be wary, because what the flow state literature is trying to do is essentially what both Rachel and Lily have suggested is challenging and controversial about doing phenomenological studies, which is that it's hard to quantify and might commit us to a worldview that is itself burdensome to take up. So the science is important and the phenomena is real, but how seriously we are to take the data and how to best interpret, understand, and even generate it is a very open and challenging question. Okay, so yeah, Descartes is doing phenomenology, right? That's what this slide is saying, that Husserl didn't invent it. You just like, that's where the word comes from, as the practice. But when Descartes is looking inwards to his internal experience and saying, I think, therefore I am, he's doing a sort of phenomenological practice. And this seems sound enough, he thinks, and he is. Okay, so that's what I just said. All right, flow states. So flow state, the term is coined by this guy, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, in the 1960s. In his graduate career, he is friends with a bunch of artists and climbers, and notices this strange thing going on with his friends, where they would sit down in a room for weeks and they would paint and become completely obsessed with the work of art that they were producing. And then as soon as it's done, that, like, having like lost sleep and forgotten to eat and just not taking care of themselves, being so obsessed and absorbed in the work of art, in the production of the work of art itself. And then as soon as it was done, throw it in the corner, gathers dust, move on to the next one, right? That to be so obsessed and committed to something and then just like forget about it as soon as it's over, it was peculiar and strange. And so Csikszentmihalyi begins interviewing his friends and his artists and creating a research program around the synchrony of reports that he was getting from them. So what's going on with this behavior? Well, we see strong motivation in the moment, and then no motivation between moments, right? If there's you just lose your attachment to the object that you're creating as soon as it's done being created, and you have sort of a different sense of self, this need to like find something new to do, rather than this need to complete what is being done. Okay, so here's an argument. One, attention is a limited resource. It's like a battery. We only have so much of it. Two, as we force ourselves to attend, we could become worse at continuing to focus, right? As the battery drains, it becomes less capable of powering its device. The more challenging an activity or task, the more attention we need to pay to it, right? Because it's demanding more of our attention. If I'm reading the Green Eggs and Ham, that takes a lot less attention than reading Csikszentmihalyi and Nakamura 2010 on flow states, right? It's a more challenging task. So from 1 and 3, challenging activities deplete attentional resources faster than easier activities. Therefore, from 2 and 4, we ought to be far less capable of performing challenging actions at length. What's wrong with the argument? How would you object to this?
I think it depends on what you define as challenging, because some, well, I don't know. I mean, if you're talking about like attention, if you're doing something like squatting, like a bunch of weight, that doesn't really require much of your attention, but more just physical stamina.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so attention is just one of the many resources that are required for performing different sorts of complex or challenging tasks. And so if we're performing a complex or challenging task that's complex and challenging on the predication of some physical feature rather than some like cognitive attentive feature, then the argument doesn't take grip. Good. That's a very good objection. So in response to it, let me just limit the argument and say that the kind of task being performed here is one that is limiting on attention and not physical form. Then what would be wrong with it? Does anybody else have any ideas? How would you object? Yeah.
Maybe the activity isn't arousing the person doing it, like an expert, I don't know, surgeon will be not fully invested in learning about, you know, anatomy because he or she is already an expert completely. So then doing something that's not as challenging is not activating his or her brain as much as.
Good. Yeah, so this is an excellent counterexample, which is to say, no, it's often the case that the simple stuff like reading Green Eggs and Ham turns out to be boring. And in being bored, that depletes us faster than the challenging activity, which would seem to hold our attention, which is also, I think the way that I would object to this is say like, look, it's just practically wrong. Experts get like way absorbed in what they do and they do it for a long period of time, even though it's complex and challenging. And in fact, probably as you suggest, because it's complex and challenging, it's not boring, right? So the activity and quality of flow state experience completely confounds the argument. In fact, attention in skilled action is better able to be sustained in high skill and challenging situations than easy ones. The book that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi wrote, like like after his dissertation became a book. That book is called Between Boredom and Anxiety, which I think I have a graph of here. So the idea is that flow occurs in this channel between boredom and anxiety, where if the challenge outstrips your skill, you become anxious. I'm not able to do this, but I need to do it, right? Oh no, what do I do? And if your skill outstrips the challenge, then you're bored. You're like, all right, this just sucks, right? But flow occurs where challenge and skill meet one another. But we'll get there. I have a slide in between. So good objections, guys. Okay, so phenomenology again is just the character of one's personal experience. Csikszentmihalyi began to see common phenomenological motifs in the surveys that he was taking of these artists. And later these motifs would be reproduced in rock climbers, in teenage bikers from Japan, in factory workers, in people from all over the world. So it's not just like a regional effect. It's like everybody everywhere. It's not like a single specific culture that produces these states, and like across gender and wage and age gaps. So there seems to be like very few, if any, limiting sociological features on flow states. They just like happen to everybody, right? And here are those phenomenological motifs that Csikszentmihalyi was picking up on. One, that when describing what it was like to be absorbed, to be in the flow, these people said that they experienced an intense and focused concentration on their activity in the present moment. The use of all sorts of like direct attention. There was a merging of action and awareness, that it felt like body and world combined, coalesced to become a single unit, so that the interactions were just exactly just what was needed to perform when it was needed and as it was needed. Likewise, there was a common loss of self-reflective consciousness, that in absorption, you lose the sense of self, like I need to be doing this, or this feels good to me. Those sorts of ego-based thoughts, whether or not they're like egocentric, that doesn't matter, but like the I that accompanies observational statements would just disappear. Like, I don't know where I went, I blacked out, right? Likewise, there was a sense that one was in control of one's actions, and that regardless of what might come, they would know what to do. There's a distortion of time. Sometimes time would go really slow, sometimes really fast. I have a friend, an artist, and she spins clay and describes like she won't eat or sleep for like 18 hours and just like be so absorbed and have no idea that it's been so long, right? Like she'll just like wake up 18 hours later and the clay piece is done. It's wild, right? So you have this like these time dilations. And an experience of intrinsic reward for activity. So the idea is that with this is that the action itself in the form of its performance is self-motivating. It feeds itself back energy, that it's not about finishing the work of art so that you get paid and that's why you do it. No, it's just about the painting itself. And insofar as you're performing that act in a state of flow or absorption, it feeds itself back the right sort of energy to maintain the high attentive state required to avoid boredom and anxiety. So just describe that. This is like the first iteration of the between boredom and the like flow channel idea, but it's been developed in more recent research to give us sort of like a slew of different emotions that come from the measure of challenge and skill together. And it's interesting, there's one of my favorite studies on this, it's just observational, so how empirically sound it is, who knows, but it does very much appear to like reflect what the researchers think it reflects, in my estimation. What they do is they take writing samples from students who were in different situations. So like a student who is way ahead of the level of the class, but doing like the same assignment. So the student's bored, and then a student who's like way below the writing level of the class, and so is anxious. And then a student who's like supposed to be right at the level of the class. And the student who's right at the level of the class has the best writing, like very clearly, like they're challenged and they're in the zone as they're writing, their voice is strong, but it doesn't have the languidness of the bored student, nor the like choppy strangeness of the anxious student. And so we can see like the actual effects of your emotional state in response to the skill, challenge, balance, and even in voice and in writing. Okay, so any questions so far? Like, what are flow states? What's phenomenology? Are we all like doing all right? Does anybody have any comments? Yeah, Rachel.
So on that graph,
Which one? This
the
one?
flow state one, why is it squiggly in the flow state?
Because flow states are wiggly and cool.
Oh,
No, so I think the idea is that this is supposed to represent that there's not like a single line, a single axis of like perfect balance between challenge and skill, that the flow channel is meant to be kind of wide, and that flow is just typically hit somewhere at a balance point in the range that here, that's what it's purporting. So the squiggly line is just saying like there's not a single axis in which flow is occurring. Okay. So what allows the state, the flow state, to occur when the right conditions are met? Well, attention, interest, as was suggested. So motivation and attention are essential to getting in the flow and remaining in it. So the distribution of attention, okay, I just said that. Attention is a limited resource, especially when we deliberately use it. So there's all sorts of interesting studies about the executive use of attention, that in deciding to attend to something, so say like this lecture, if you are having to tell yourself, or focus, right? And you're focusing, right? This depletes your attentional capacity. And then when you try to attend to other stuff, say like after this lecture, you'll be worse at it. So one of these studies, they had, I don't remember what the original test, like some sort of like math problem, or it's almost always like an arithmetic problem, something like that, where the problem demands the use of executive attention. We're like having to like executively focus. And then they put the subjects in a social situation right afterwards. And the participants who were placed in the executive attention using condition were like across the board more awkward and worse off in the social situation right afterwards, as opposed to a control who were just like put in the social situation. They were far more fluid and sociable, amenable. So this shows that like executive attention depletes our like energy and resources to do other tasks after it's been used up. But this is to be contrasted with flow, where in absorption, in these states of flow, the resource of attention feeds back into itself, that you become lost in your activity. You're so attentive to it that you merge with the world, that you lose sense of time and self, that all of that extra information that you don't need to like do the act well, it's just like, look, I'm doing it. Look, Mom, no hands. You don't need to like do that as you're performing in order to perform well. You just lose all that because your attention is completely focused on the act itself. This state, for whatever reason, doesn't deplete the executive features of attention. It feeds back into itself and makes the action, so it's said, feel effortless. Now, an aside, when we're talking about effortless action, which is like another moniker for the flow state, it is certainly not effortless, right? When you watch the figure skater at the Winter Olympics do like the quadruple axel backflip, who knows what the heck thing that just looks insane. It appears graceful and effortless, but it takes a lot of effort, takes all sorts of muscle memory and training and like strength to lift yourself up like that, right? So the effortlessness should be understood as like metaphor, right? For this quality of like attention feeding back on itself, and not like a literal effortlessness and the like lack of power that is required in the flow. Action doesn't get easier, it just feels easier. And that's why we say effortless action is what happens in the flow. So if flow states are associated with a lack of reflective self-consciousness, then they must be intrinsically motivated, because I'm not thinking about what this action is good for me for, and that's why I'm doing it. I'm not doing it with any sense of self. I'm only doing it because it feeds itself. The action itself is self-propelling. It's not propelled by like, what comes after, like when you're done climbing the mountain, the only reason you're climbing it is like be at the top. No, you're doing it like for the activity itself. The only reason that you're creating the work of art is to get paid. No, you're doing it because like you have that artist's feeling of necessity, right? Feeding through the expression of the brush against the canvas, right? Extrinsic motivation requires self-referential and future-oriented reflection. Even so, how is intrinsic reward motivating in the right way for out of ego? How does it motivate us to keep the right sort of attention? And so what Csikszentmihalyi suggests is that there's an important connection between flow state and identity, which is where we begin to see happiness come from our thinking about flow. So do we become automata when we're in the flow? Do we become routinized robots? Right? You lose sense of self and of time. You're not thinking about it. A robot doesn't think about themselves as they do what they do, and they seem to do what they do pretty fluidly and well. Are we just automata when we're in the flow? What do you think? When you get super absorbed, are you just an action robot? Yeah.
I don't think so, because a robot would lack that phenomenological experience that allows someone to get into a flow state that's highly personal, you know, that literally comes from experiencing this thing, the practice of it to deliver this as a product. And if you were an automata, that literally is lacking perception.
Yeah.
So,
Good. So there's a feature of having an experience of the act itself as measured between skill and challenge. That is what enables or sparks the production of this quality at all. Good. So the self is like required to get into it. But then somehow mysteriously, phenomenologically seems to disappear amidst it. And so we recognize that the ego is a feature necessary to getting there and then goes away. So what happens on the other end, and how do we make sense of the action going on in the middle, phenomenologically at least? So as the story goes, according to Csikszentmihalyi, flow states are critical to healthy self-development because of just this phenomenon. That when we enter the flow state, we return on the other side and recognize ourselves as having been capable of the action performed. And as such, we grow in confidence of our capabilities, and this sort of like builds the ego, builds the self. So for example, think of the rock climber who climbs at the limit of their ability and then gets to the top. They reach the top of the route, and their action is broken because there's nowhere else to climb, right? They're up at the top, and exits the flow state. This sort of person has performed an action at the limit of their skill, at the height of challenge that their level of skill is able to achieve, and they've done it. And in doing it, recognize I'm the sort of person that is capable of doing this. And it's in this like this fluctuation of self experiencing the ability to do just so, to the ability to do exactly as is needed, but it requires everything. And then giving up the self in order to give the action everything, and then returning back to it, that gives us this like development of identity, this feeling of like, look, I just did that. Even though I didn't feel like I was present, I lost sense of self and time. I'm now back, and I recognize that I had to have done that, and so I can do that, and this like grows ourself. And so flow and what's known as positive psychology often go hand in hand for this reason. Actually, I think I have here's the self emerges when consciousness comes into existence and becomes aware of itself as information about the body's subjective states, past memories, and personal futures. This is a quote from Csikszentmihalyi. So I think, yeah. So here is our climber climbing up the hill, and then gets all the way to the top. I think this is a picture of K2 in Iran. And then has this like reflective moment of like, look, I just did that. And thus you have this positive feature of the flow experience. And in positive psychology, the idea is that rather than treating trauma, you reinforce positive mental qualities. So rather than saying, hey, like, let's dig into where your issues come from, say, what have you been doing that's been working well for you? And let's like encourage doing that. And that's why it's called like positive, because you're not focusing on the negative, you're encouraging like doing more positive stuff. And the suggestion is that by encouraging those kinds of actions and engaging patients in the activities that allow them to get into flow states, they have this like growth of identity away from the trauma, and then they don't need to like even deal with it at all because they've overcome it. They've overcome themselves and grow themselves through it. Okay, so there's another feature. If flow and attention and identity are all linked together, then certainly there's a psychology of flow, right? That the purpose of the positive psychological movement of using flow as a therapeutic tool is to help people get into it. And in helping people get into it, we can understand the state of mind associated with being in the flow, which is called the autotellic personality, which got dealt with quite a bit in the reading for this week. So auto just means of its own, and telic means end or goal oriented, right? We've seen like telos in the Aristotelian readings. So the idea is just that the autotellic person is someone who seeks challenging, hard actions for the sake of their challenge themselves, someone who seeks to be challenged for the sake of being challenged, and not just to escape, but to flow in challenge. So an autotellic person is just a person who is intrinsically motivated to engage in activities, a person who generally enjoys doing things for their own sake rather than for some external goal. And it is the autotellic person who is statistically more likely to be active to new receptive experiences. They're more likely to be curious and open to challenges and ready to engage with them. And importantly, the autotellic person is more likely to enter into flow states more regularly and at all than a non-autotellic person. Okay, any questions so far? How are we doing? Yeah. Autotellic personality, relation of identity and flow. Okay. So what do you think? Have you experienced a flow state before? What was it like? Has anybody been in the flow before?
I have. I could speak to that.
Sure.
I feel like it's almost, like collectively what we've been talking about, like having expertise and losing, the sense of time. It's almost like you step into this altered consciousness, right? Where your skills are at such a high level that everything just takes over. It's almost like you're not in control, but you are in control. And then all these thought processes are happening like super quickly. So you're like in the hyperlane, like thinking mode, even though you're not actively in the seat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Good. Okay. So Kyle, you raised your hand too.
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. Back in football in high school, when I would go out for to receive a catch, I would enter this flow state to where, from the moment I take off from the line, I would be I remember exactly what would happen, but it would be almost like an out of body experience because I'm just so in tune with everything about my body that I can almost just have a 3D view of exactly everything that's happening and just point to point, second to second, millisecond to millisecond, what I was thinking, which way did I turn, how did I get past that receiver when I caught the ball, what was my thought process on it. I could literally remember exactly what happened in multiple receives and touchdowns. So
Cool. Yeah. So it sounds like Lily and Kyle have a similar experience of really strongly cognitively active. Like what did you say, Lily? Like the hyper drive thinking? Is that
like if you're in hyperdrive mode.
yeah. Yeah, so like of a simultaneous hyperdrive mode in thought, but then also it being third personal, external, that it's almost like exported out of us so that the body is just doing it itself. So like it's like both of these things. There's the just do it and there's the cognition and action, and both are like occurring simultaneously, at least so it seems, at least in our phenomenology, in our experience of what it's like to be in these states, they come apart. Look, and we're caught in the middle. Like there's our body and there's our mind, and they come apart, but here we are like in this space of action in between. So let's do a poll between just do it and cognition and action. Now we've like defined and looked at like what flow states are like, how they affect identity, and like autotellic personality and stuff. So coming back now with an understanding of flow, who thinks that expertise is just do it?
Is that like the blackout?
The blackout, yeah. So to be an expert is to be absorbed, and the more absorbed you are, the more expert you are. Okay. Who thinks that it's cognition and action? The more expert you are, the more you know, and the more you're able to think through the problems as you perform. Yeah, cool. It's like a pretty even split. Everybody in class, so like you guys can't see online, but everybody in class raised their hand for the just do it view. And it looks like most of us online were cognition and action. It's kind of interesting. Every time I teach this lecture, it's a different split. So I think it is truly just like a bit of a matter of intuition and not clear at all what is going on, but so fascinating, right? That you have this like these simultaneous experiences, these very strong intuitions and experiences as of both forms of being an expert, being in the zone. Yeah, so this is why I research this stuff. I think it's endlessly fascinating. Does anybody want to defend their answer?
I do, absolutely.
Okay.
Just do it implies anybody can just do it, right? But cognition and action, like in like that phrase alone, it requires thinking, and it requires a certain type of concentrated thinking in whatever thing that you're doing. That's
Okay.
that's my defense.
Yeah, so anybody can like get absorbed, but it takes an expert to not just get absorbed, but to know exactly how to deal with the complex affordances and challenges of their expert task. Not anybody can be an expert. And so like the difference, an example is the third grade reader can, assuming you can get into a flow state reading, can get into a flow state reading Green Eggs and Ham, but certainly would have trouble with Joyce's Ulysses, whereas the expert reader can get into the flow reading Ulysses or something. Yeah, cool. Tim, you took off your mic. Did you want to defend your answer?
I think it depends on the kind of activity, and I would also push back with that you could like know everything there is behind like hitting a home run, but that doesn't mean you can hit a home run.
Yeah.
So I think it more depends, like with doing it, like less cognitive tasks, that I feel like that applies more. So like athletic activities, professional sports players, and just like if you're performing something, but like if you're doing something like writing or maybe like solving a math problem, that's where it's like more cognition and action, because like in order to like become an expert athlete, you have to practice, you have to like do it over and over. But like in order to become a good mathematician, you also you have to like break down the steps and understand the concepts, and you also have to practice, but like it's like more leaning towards cognition.
Yeah, so that's a cool suggestion, and it sort of might be saying that, look, this dichotomy that I've set up, like in the images, the images being juxtaposed, that's a false dichotomy, and it's just like totally wrong juxtaposition. That these aren't like mutually exclusive actions with one another. They're just actions of a different kind, right? And so it's apples to oranges. Of course, we're going to have different theories of expertise for these different kinds of action. And that may be where there is overlap. The climber does think sometimes, but they get really physically absorbed because it's a really physical activity. And likewise, the chess player in like a low time control might just start like reacting, start moving the chess pieces about, but mostly they have time to think through, right? And so there's certainly like an overlap of the like hyperdrive thinking, I like that term, and our like physical absorption, but the kind of performance that we're doing affords its own sort of degree of like one or the other skill. And just because a particular action affords more of the physical absorption and some other action affords more of a cognitive sort of oversight of the activity doesn't mean that our theories of expertise which explain and model either of these activities are at odds with one another. It's apples and oranges. It's very cool. Yeah. I think that's probably the right thing to say. I lost my mouth over here. Oh, yeah. Okay. The TV and the laptop screen are like completely different sizes. So there's like a very small window on the TV if the mouse gets lost over there, where I can bring it back. Okay, so let's move on to some issues, problems, and worries with flow states. So one, what counts as a flow state? What, like, does my driving in the car and just like commuting to work and all of a sudden I'm at home or at work, does that count as a flow state? Does brushing my teeth in the morning, does the way that I like wash my hair, sure, I don't ever think about it, but certainly like I have patterns of like how I wash my hair or whatever, is that a flow? Where the limits and boundaries of flow, and how do we know when it's happening and when it's not? Can it occur like in degree, or is it like a on switch that flips? Very open question, especially when we're dealing with evidence from phenomenology. The phenomenology doesn't give us clear, precise boundaries or answers to those kinds of questions. And so when you say, oh, what's a flow state? And you say, I don't know, but I know what people describe it as like, that is not a very scientific answer. It's not a very satisfying answer, but it is the best we got. So that's a bit of a troubling worry. And flow is good, ... question mark. Okay, self-reporting worse. I think I'm going to talk about all of these individually. I'm pretty sure I have slides for all of them. Okay, so first, what counts as a flow state? This is an explosion because when we get so many reports from so many different people in so many different circumstances, we get motifs as I've described them, but you don't get the necessary and sufficient conditions for flow. You get things like microflow, like brushing your teeth or washing your hair. You get a conceptual explosion. If we want to count microflow as a flow state, if we want to count the autopiloting in your car as a flow state, if we want to call like what the wide receiver or the dancer does as a flow state, they're all a little bit different, but they all like fit under the moniker flow. Well, it seems like flow has lost its explanatory power in accommodating so many different kinds of experience. And this is a problem for any concept. Should we just where do we make the distinctions? Where do we slice things up so that we have more fruitful explanatory concepts to help us navigate the space of diversity of experience? And flow is good, right? I've been intimating that flow and happiness and the development of identity are all interlinked, and the autotellic personality is someone who seeks out challenging activities for their own sake, and so like becomes more successful and engages in flow more often. And positive psychology helps us deal with our therapeutic worries and trouble and trauma and all that. So flow must be good, right? Well, maybe not necessarily, right? That you can get in a flow state sitting on your couch, Cheeto dusted fingertips and an Xbox controller, and all of a sudden it's 18 hours later and you're still dying to the Elden Ring boss that has been kicking your butt, right? So you get in the flow, but what good have you done yourself or the world or anybody, right? You just like World of Warcraft, bro, you know, taking over the world of Warcraft. Similarly, has anybody seen Dexter? You know this show? So Dexter, Michael C. Hall plays a serial killer with a code. And he has this dark passenger, which makes him want to kill people. But he was adopted by a cop, and the cop, rather than turning in his young adopted son, gave him a code that would help him channel his serial killer energy tendencies into the worst people in society who escape justice. So Dexter is a serial killer, but rather than like hunting sorority girls through Florida and, you know, like all that sort of evil shit, he tracks down murderers and pedophiles and, you know, just like awful people who escape the law for some reason, like the court screws up the evidence or whatever. And so Dexter finds them and Dexter kills them. Anyways, that's the premise. What happens is Dexter sets up this like elaborate kill room with like plastic on the walls and a table he wraps them up in. And the idea is that like he won't ever get caught because he creates this perfect scenario. But as he's creating this room, the show like gives you a montage, right? Where you get like some dramatic music and you see sort of like the creation of this murder room as like an aesthetic sort of feature of activity, where Dexter is very certainly, or at least so the show represents, in a flow state as he's like putting together his murder room. So flow is good, right? Well, maybe not. I can get in the flow working in a soup kitchen, right? Like feeding homeless people. I can get in the flow playing Elden Ring for 12 hours, doing literally nothing for myself or society, just like having a damn good time. And I could get in the flow creating a like murder room for like escaped criminals or whatever, right? So it seems if flow associates itself with evil actions, with value neutral actions, and with good actions, that flow itself is value neutral, right? And maybe even problematically, when flow, if flow is like the optimal form of experience and I get in the flow doing something good, then I've done something good optimally. So I've done better, right? I haven't done good poorly. The opposite with evil. If I get in a flow state doing something evil, then I've done evil optimally. And that's like optimally evil. It's really bad, right? And so flow might be even like worse in cases of moral questionability, right? So how we think of flows as a moral object becomes a social question that is not easy to answer. Problems with self-reporting. So like flow studies are just all based on reports, and people are very foggy mirrors to themselves. We are very bad at understanding who we are as people generally. It's not a skill that we're taught. It's not one that we're given much time or energy or resources to develop. And so we are very often unreliable narrators of our own lives. And there's all sorts of interesting study about the quality of reports, like empirical reports, given post experiment or post exercise, and given in experiment and in exercise. It turns out like the ones given like as you're performing are more associated with what and how the action is being performed than the ones performed after. So like we tell ourselves stories about what it's like to be in the flow, and then afterwards those stories color our experience of what we just did, but maybe that isn't what we just did, right? We're not aware of it. Experts will move their eyes in particular ways, but then describe looking in a way that's completely inconsistent with how their eyes were tracked on screen, right? So you might think that you're doing one thing, but you're actually doing a totally other thing. And so should we trust these reports? Like, do flow states actually happen? Seems like they do, but where's the evidence that is sound? Okay, carbon penetration, we'll skip. Another interesting thing about memory is the less often you remember, like explicitly remember a memory, the clearer it is. So the more often you remember it, the more often you recite a memory, the more skewed the memory becomes. Like you add details and like features of your present emotional state into the telling of the story. And then that like compounds over time. Like every time you're in a new emotional state and you tell the story, it like colors and flavors it. And so it's like a game of telephone with yourself and your own memories. If you really cherish a memory, stop remembering it, because then it won't change so much. And priorities in education and development. How should we use flow states? So do we educate to create autotellic students so that they seek out flow, so that they get flow themselves, or do we educate to imbue knowledge? Should we be more focused on giving students the opportunity to become people that will get knowledge themselves, or do we just like give them the knowledge that they need? Where should we focus ourselves in understanding and recognizing the importance of flow states? Should we make them the priority in education as the Montessori school system does, or should we do something different? Should we do as we're doing already and kind of just hope that people become autotellically? So we can prioritize proper behavior, proper education, but if flow states are value neutral, then producing a flowy population might not actually produce a good population. It might produce a whole bunch of individuals that are good at doing what they do, but is it one that actually works? I have a group activity. I think we might skip it. The idea was, so normally I teach this earlier in the semester, and I would have you come up with like a strategy to get into flow in the classroom, and then I would do it in the classroom. But seeing as this is our very final lecture and class together, that seems like it won't really help anybody. So there you go. But does anybody have thoughts about this? Like, can, in a philosophy class, or at least like a theory-based class, if we want to be more general, in a theory-based class, is getting into a flow state, like for learning or whatever, something that a professor, a teacher like myself should prioritize, one, and if so, how can they prioritize and help engage their students? Does anybody have any intuitions about this? Like one should and two how? No intuitions. Yeah.
I definitely think that it's something that teachers and professors should be trying to implement in their classrooms. Like to give an example of a writing class where there were people who were above the curve of what the class is supposed to be, and they performed more poorly in the writing assignments because they were bored while they were doing them.
Mm-hmm.
And then students who were with the curve and were in the flow state and were doing very well. And then the students who were a little behind, who were anxious about the assignments and couldn't quite live up to that expectation. And so I definitely think it's something that teachers should try to implement in their classroom, but I would have no idea how to do that and also appeal to the amount of students that a lot of teachers have in their classrooms.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like one of the biggest challenges that I have is that I have students of all different levels of education and capacity as well. And so like it's a goal, a challenge to teach in a way that makes the content accessible to the lowest common denominator, but also like challenging enough to keep interested the highest common denominator, and then like, you know, everybody in between. It's a real challenge. So like my solution is this class, right, is to like choose your own adventure where everything is optional and you choose it yourself and get invested, because I think you don't get in the flow when you're forced to do something you don't want to do. Even if like you would want to do it, like not having chosen it yourself just like already excludes the possibility of like getting in the zone, being creatively inspired by it. So in empowering you all as students to make your own choices and to choose your own work and how you want to engage philosophically with the philosophical material, gives you the power to become committed yourselves, and so to get interested, get stoked, and do good work. And I'll say this much, since I've been doing this like choose your own adventure grading system, I grade so much better work. Like, it absolutely sucks grading bullshit, and you guys bullshit all the time. I did when I was in your position. Like, you got to write a 5 to 8 page paper, and your idea is only like 3 pages, and so you just like write a bunch of crap that fills the word space because you have to do the assignment, or else you get a C+ overall in the grade book. It's awful, right? And so, like, as an educator, like, I end up seeing all sorts of crap that clearly like the student didn't want to do, but not anymore. Since I've been doing this, like, you guys write awesome discussion posts together and like cool write-ups, and I get all sorts of neat like creative assignments left and right. So hopefully, at least like outside of the class, and maybe even in lecture here, you guys, you're experiencing at least a little bit of the invitation to be autotelic with the course material. That's been my solution, but doing it like actually in class, I think it's a real challenge. I'm not certain how to do it. Students in the past have suggested like meditation exercises or stretching or something, but I'm not convinced that that's something anybody wants to do all the time, and it might be a little exclusive, different people. Anyways, there you go. Any other stuff about flow? Questions for me?
With the education thing, I think particularly in K through 12 education, if students were given more time outside of school, it like encouraged to learn outside of school, that would more naturally lead to them discovering their own sort of flow state, and also there should be a focus more on like hands-on learning, because that like allows kids to discover like what processes they actually like to do and can get lost in. Like, for instance, I thought I wanted to do architecture, but like there weren't any classes at my high school in architecture. And then once I got here, I was like, oh, I don't really like this. So yeah, just like hands-on experience. And I don't think you have to sacrifice knowledge for hands-on learning, and also like more freedom outside of school for people to explore their interests.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And this is kind of the premise of the Montessori school, is to make education fluid so that you can go outside if you want to, you can take math if you want to, you got to do all of it in the day, but you sort of structure yourself, and kids of different ages are teaching each other. And yeah, it just takes a little bit of innovation and a little bit of reform to, I think, get a whole lot of this kind of benefit out of a classroom. And it's not hard. I mean, we're doing it here. And I mean, like, it amazes me that, like, as like a political aside, that there's been like no substantive educational reform since basically John Dewey in 1940, whatever. It's wild, right? Like, seems that everything needs to grow and change as we grow and change culturally, and education is something that has certainly fallen behind, and teachers are not paid enough. So go out into your lives, make education a priority, and pay teachers more. Okay, so I suppose on that note, please fill out your course evaluations. They're really important. I'm going on the job market, like I said, and this fall. I'm only teaching one more class, so the things that you guys say on your evals will be read by all of my potential future employers. And so you can help make the dream of doing this forever a reality. And I would be very grateful if you added your words to help bolster that possibility. Because I want to do this. I want to keep teaching. I love teaching, and I've loved having you as students, and thanks for, a great semester. The end.
Thank you.
Yay, thank you.
Thank you. This was a sweet class.